Jay, first of all, thank you for joining me. I'd like to start off by asking you to just share a little bit of background about ThinkWhy and your role within the company. Can you tell us a little bit about what the company does and what type of role you play?
Sure, and thanks for having me today. At ThinkWhy, we track the labor market and how that impacts salaries across the country. So our Labor IQ platform provides salary compensation information for more than 19,000 job titles across about 400 markets in the country. And so those salaries and the demand for that labor is influenced heavily by what's happening in the economy and what's happening in different segments. And so we help people figure that out.
Before we dive into what's going on now, I'd like to take a step back and look at what was going on, particularly in the construction marketplace prior to the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the trends were, both from a general economic standpoint, but specifically looking at the labor trends that were going on in construction before the pandemic hit?
The construction industry has had quite a climb back from what happened during the last recession. And so, if you look back previous to, say, 2007, 2008, there was somewhere around a peak of about, I think it was around 7.7 million jobs. That declined dramatically during that period. And it's taken about 10 or 12 years to actually get all of those jobs back. And actually, we didn't quite recapture all of them. So when I speak with friends that I have in the construction industry in one way or another, and just the amount of labor, or really lack of labor over the last decade has been really challenging. Heading up to the pandemic, even as we started to recapture all the jobs that were lost during that period, there were still challenges with supply of that labor.
I mean, obviously, we're seeing a lot of unemployment right now. Can you talk about what you've seen going on in the construction workforce at this point?
If we look at, and again, I'm talking about really just overall construction, which includes a lot of different types. There were a little over a million, about 1.1 million jobs lost between February and April. And so as businesses hit pause to figure out safety protocols for one, whether they were moving forward with certain kind of construction work or not. So there were about 1.1 million jobs lost. But since then, there have been a lot of jobs regained back. And again, just speaking with people that I know, things are almost like business back to usual. And again, this is a lot in the residential multifamily space. That's where a lot of my background resides. More back to usual at a different level than it was before. So not necessarily all jobs have been recaptured, but broadly what we're seeing is there were 453,000 jobs added back just in May. And then there were we just got the news this morning that there were another 158,000 added back. So the industry is bouncing back quite well. I mean, following the last recession, if you look at the number of jobs in the last 2 months that have been recaptured, it took 47 months to recapture that many jobs coming out of the last cycle. So it's good news, but obviously there's a little bit of a bumpy road ahead of us.
So you talk about a bumpy road ahead. Can you talk about it a little further as far as what you see as some of the opportunities, the projections that you're looking at for the construction industry and construction employment here within, I would say, through the end of 2020 and possibly looking at what we might see going into 2021 as well?
Yeah, I believe it'll vary. It'll start to vary out by sector, by metro, and all sorts of variances. But I think from a really macro level, if you look at some of these big construction jobs, they already had their funding set up prior to the pandemic. And so in terms of the starts that had already occurred, those will move forward and you'll have that. I think their concern's going to be once we get a few months from now, and the new deals that would have started in the second half of this year, are they able to continue or not? I think there will be, from my conversations with people, when a construction deal is going to get built, and particularly on the commercial real estate side, somebody's investing in that. And so they're looking at the marketplace and they're feeling comfortable that they can make an investment and that it will get its returns once it's actually delivered a couple years from now. The banks, on the other hand, particularly the larger banks, I think are going to be a little bit more cautious and watch and truly try to understand what's happening. Are we really seeing demand for these different types of product come back or not? So as we think of how that relates maybe to different types of construction, again, I come from the multifamily side. Collections for multifamily rents, as an example, have remained fairly high. And so if we look at business sectors, say like the financial activity sector, so this would be people in real estate, but also different types of financial vehicles. Financial activities has barely been hit overall during all of this. And those are some of the types of roles that somebody, earlier in their career is likely going to earn above an average wage. And when they go out and they're looking for somewhere to live, they're going to live in a lot of times a newer apartment. And so there's some fundamentals if you look at which jobs are being added or kept. I think that could help something like multifamily. On the flip side, think of your normal shopping center. that's going to be anchored by maybe a grocery store, and then it'll have some retail components to it, maybe a few clothing centers and some restaurants. Well, if we look at this point right now, restaurant employment is down 25% from where it was earlier in the year. Clothing stores, the number of jobs is down 40%. That translates back into, well, they don't see the staff or the need to sell, the ability, really, not necessarily the need, but the ability to really get that. And so I mentioned one type of maybe multifamily apartments that could have some level of success. I would have some concerns, obviously, about components of retail and then obviously leisure, hospitality type jobs.
Okay, so it sounds like there are some sectors that are definitely going to see more growth than others going forward. Do you see certain regions of the country that are recovering faster than others at this point?
We know real estate's all about location. And so if you just start from the market level, if you look at the unemployment rates, they are much different in terms of how much they've risen. If you look at some of the southern and kind of middle of the country states, their unemployment rates haven't risen nearly as much. And so not as many jobs have been cut. So if we think about the road to recovery, it's likely that some of these states, and they're ones, by the way, where populations have been growing by an outsized proportion of the last 10 or 20 years. That's where I could see construction coming back, whether it's infrastructure type construction or for new offices or, again, residential. I think those southern and more centralized states, that's where we're going to see more come back. Where we look at where unemployment's really been impacted, it's on the coast. And some of those, we've had certain hotspots in California and in New York. And I think those are going to, again, have a little bit longer road to recovery, but at least we're starting to see some positive momentum. I think what's really interesting, this might not vary necessarily by either of those states. It's once you get within a metro, there has been a lot written and talked about in terms of being in urban areas where things are really dense, and then being in suburban areas where the density is not quite the challenge as it relates to things where people are concerned about the virus. So even within these metros, I think we'll probably see construction return to the suburbs faster than it will the urban cores.
I can see where that would make sense, though, with the concerns about being socially distant, staying more separated. That does seem to make sense that could be a potential. So looking at longer term, where do you see us going in the construction industry when it comes to the employment status? There were some huge shortages in labor availability, a lot of skills gap, and now we're seeing significant numbers of people returning into the economy as a whole. Obviously there were a larger number of people that were added to the payrolls in the most recent employment data coming out. Do you see that as being an opportunity for the construction industry to rebuild that workforce and help to offset some of the shortages that we've seen in the past?
The bounce back we've seen in overall employment the last 2 months will certainly benefit the construction industry. And construction is about growth. It's about building, again, new highways or new schools or new residences. And so to do that, we need a healthy economy. And so, just if you look at the month of May, so in May consensus, economists around the country, just as a consensus thought we'd still lose about 8 million more jobs. Instead, the number, and it got revised up this morning, instead we gained 2.7 million. So you think about that, it's almost an 11 million job gap. As we think about what that means for our economy, and then as it relates back to construction, we were projecting prior to getting that very positive upside news that the overall economy wouldn't really get back to its previous level of employment for about 5 or 6 years. The terrific news we've had over the last couple of months suggests that we could pull that back. It's probably looking more like maybe 2023 or 2024. I know that's still a little bit of ways away, but that's certainly more positive news. We'd love it to continue heading that direction. Obviously, there are some things with virus counts rising that could delay that a little bit. But right now, I think we're heading at a little bit more positive pace than we thought previously. And so that's really important for construction because it's going to give confidence for people to go out and buy new houses or to go out and take more office space when people do start returning to office more because they're filling up those types of jobs. So yeah, it'll be incredibly important. I think the real difference, though, even if we just plugged in, say, 2023 as a date, there will be, I think, parts of construction that will lead that and some that will lag that. And again, it gets back to which of those fundamentals, which of those demand drivers are changing in the short term. What's happening now, really, a lot of times they're building for 2 or 3 years out. But what happens now influences whether they can even start those deals. I think there will be some that lag, some that lead, but overall things are looking better than they did 2 months ago.
Depending on certain legislation that's being proposed it could help to accelerate that further, whether it's infrastructure investment or even additional stimulus. There could be some opportunities for further growth going forward.
We're waiting to see what some of that, but again, there are a lot of things out of our control that can influence those decisions. So we all hope for that things continue to get better.
Well, thank you, Jay. I think unless you have anything else that you'd like to add, I think that this really covers a lot of what I was hoping to cover today, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.